So if you couldn't tell, this is welcome to the social distancing edition of the meetup. Thanks everybody for coming. Like I said, I'm glad to see some people who aren't ordinarily able to come to our meetups join us for the day. Given our presentation tonight, it's going to be TJ. TJ is going to show us about some things about Docker, not just using it in development, but also in production and what some things look like on that front. I'll let him give a more detailed introduction when he gets started. Want to say thanks to our sponsors. Obviously, we're not making use of the location that the Institute for Software Integrated Systems at Vanderbilt provides, but they've been really great since the fall when we kind of had to find a new spot really quickly. And Stephen Rees has been part of the team to kind of help us get set up there and make us welcome. Are we recording this session? Yes, we are recording the session. Make us feel welcome every month over there. Also, thanks to Ramsey Solutions for providing a lot of the financial assistance that helps us provide food and whatnot to everybody every month, except for this month, obviously. Order your own food. Upcoming conferences, sadly, PHP Tech that was supposed to be in Nashville has been canceled, and Laracon in Atlanta has been canceled as well. The Dutch PHP conference is now going to be online and it's free, so check that out. That could be a really great way to continue your learning while we're all kind of cooped up here. Just in case, who knows what the future is going to look like and how long we'll need to do the social distancing thing. But I know the Longhorn PHP conference is accepting calls for papers until June 1st. So might be good to, you've got a little extra time on your hands, perhaps kind of sharpen your tools there and consider giving a talk. Submitting a talk and seeing what you could do at one of these conferences. I should say as well, and I was going to mention this later, but if you're considering giving a talk, but you're not necessarily great in front of crowds. And I should mention Longhorn is in October, the actual conference. They're accepting papers through June 1st. If you've been wanting to kind of hone your speaking skills, but you're not great in front of crowds, or maybe you feel a little too reliant on notes, right now is the perfect time because we'll be doing these virtual meetups as long as we need to socially distance, which is at the very least going to be at least one more month. So if you would like to speak next month and you've got something to share that you feel will be valuable to the PHP community, even if it's not specifically about PHP, such as Docker, which we're doing tonight, feel free to let me know. Send that to organizers at nashvillephp.org and get a hold of us, or you can get a hold of us on Slack. You can get a hold of me, TJ, Ben, Ramsey, and we'd love to have you give a talk. So that could be a really great opportunity to kind of get your feet wet. Any other news and info anyone has to share, feel free to speak up. You can drop stuff in the chat as well, either the Zoom chat, or of course you can feel free to drop stuff in the Slack chat too. So anyone know of anyone who's hiring? I've seen a few things come across my desk that I have immediately posted to the PHP Slack. That's kind of typically what I do. So check there if you're looking for work. I think we are in a pretty fortunate industry where a lot of us have not necessarily lost our roles, but that doesn't mean that everyone's still in that position. So if you're looking for new work, or perhaps even looking for something a little more stable, feel free to check the Slack room for job postings. And if you know of something, feel free to pass it along there too. Always appreciate that. Current PHP releases, currently active in active support. The most recent version 7.4.4. 7.3.16 still in active support. Security support for 7.2 is ending in November. So if you're working at a workplace or you've got a project that's still on 7.2, now's a really good time to start moving towards 7.3 and 7.4. The upgrade path between these is not a big jump. You're not really looking at big breaking changes or anything. And so you should be able to fairly easily move up to these versions. I would encourage you to do that sooner rather than later. These versions are all end of life. So no more updates, no more security support for any of these for anything in the 5 branch or 7.0 or 7.1. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to speak, feel free, please reach out to us. We'd love to have the community giving talks to, people from the community giving talks to the community. So if you want to speak, if you want to sponsor, or you have news to share, you can pass it along there too, and we'll post it to the Slack. We'll bring it up during these meetups, and once we're able to get back to the monthly lunches, we'll pass those bits of news along there too. So. Let's see, and here are the ways, especially while we're socially distancing, here are the great ways to kind of keep in touch with the community. If you're not in the Slack, I would encourage you to check that out. Go to nashdev.com and you can sign up. Of course, there's a link to our Meetup and our website, which website's a good spot to sort of start, and you can find all of these things through our website. So I believe that is it. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to TJ. Let me stop sharing and let TJ take over. TJ, if you'll make me the host, then you can take it from here.
Kevin, you are now the host.
I have all the power.
That's right. So in case somebody wants to get in. Oh, look, I can actually share my screen now. Yay. Can everybody see my Panther background?
Yes.
Yes.
Nice. Okay. So this is kind of a more informal thing. I've prepared some things and put together some things, but I don't really have any slides or anything. I thought I would really just kind of demo Docker and its capabilities and the things. So this kind of came because people were asking in the Slack different things about Docker, and I think somebody said, well, we should talk about it at our meetup. So I, for better or worse, volunteered to do that. So let me pull up my notes here. So like I said, I don't have any slides, but I did want to just briefly cover kind of what Docker is and what it does. So when you're talking about Docker is an application or a service that runs on your various machines, primarily Linux, and at least in the Linux PHP world. There actually are Docker, Windows images, and you can put Docker on Windows into Windows mode and run Windows containers, but that's kind of a Windows thing. I'm actually doing that with a project at work where we're doing C# and it requires Windows. But that aside, for our purposes, Docker is a service or an application that runs on Linux. And then there are Mac OS and Windows applications. And what those are doing in the background are running a very small light VM that runs Linux. Because the containers that we'll be running are Linux containers or Linux-based containers. So when you're talking about Docker, you'll hear the word image thrown around, and you'll hear the word container thrown around. An image is really just a package of things that you're going to want to run in that particular image. So the simplest example really is Bash, the Docker Bash image. So it's just enough in that container. In that image to spin up a container that has Bash, and it has all the necessary APIs and Linux things that it expects to be in place to run Bash. And so that's an image. It's a package of things to run a specific instance or application of something. And then you hear the word container. A container is an image that is running. And so it is, when it's running, everything that's going on in that container is ephemeral. When you spin down that container, nothing inside it, nothing you did in it will be retained or remembered. So an image is a thing, a package of applications or an application, and then a container is a running instance of that thing. Let's see. An application, typically, when you're talking specifically about a PHP application, or most applications, are going to require more than one running container to do its thing, and that's expected and normal. For instance, the environment that I'm going to be demoing is going to be utilizing 3 containers. It's going to be an Nginx container, a PHP container, and a database container. Containers utilize the host system's kernel. So you're in the case of Windows and Mac, you're running a virtual environment, but in production and on Linux, it's just running the things inside that container that it needs. And through virtualization technologies, it uses the host's kernel to do what it needs to do. Let's see, I already mentioned the C# application I'm working on, because Windows containers are a thing, but they only run on Windows, whereas Linux containers will run on all 3 platforms. Okay, so the bash container I thought was a good place to start, or the bash image. You will hear me mix up image and container often, because I do. But hopefully you've understood the subtle difference that I've mentioned between images and containers. So I have Docker installed on this computer, and I want to run this bash image. I have bash on this computer, or I'm actually running fish, but I have a shell on this computer. But let's just say I'm in an environment, I want something specific, whatever. I'm going to run this command, docker run, and then I is for interactive. I don't remember what T stands for.
TTY.
What's that?
It stands for a TTY.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
Which I can't remember exactly what TTY stands for, but
yeah, it has to do with an interactive terminal.
The teletype.
So, and then here, with this -v argument, I am mounting my user's TJ Git directory into a location called local fs in this bash container. And I'm going to use bash 4.4. So this part here tells the Docker command which image to run. And I'm running bash 4.4. So the colon 4.4, that's just a tag. It could be anything, but in this case, it's saying I could do colon latest, and it would pull the latest. The downside with the latest, because it's a convention, people use use latest as a tag. The downside is, as long as I have an image downloaded locally that matches latest, until I do a pull manually, it won't update that. So I usually personally like to specify the exact tag that I want to use. Apparently there's bash 5.0.16, 5.0. Anyway, the one that I decided to use is 4.4 for reasons known only to me at the time. I don't even remember now. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And you'll notice that it says it can't find the image locally. So it's going to go out to the Docker hub, and it's going to pull it down, which it did. And so once the pull is complete, it says, hey, I downloaded this image. And now you'll see I'm in a different shell. You might notice it looks different from my prompt earlier. That's the default shell. And if I, that's one of my shortcuts, ls, lah. So you'll notice here I have this directory local fs. So if you noticed in that command where I mentioned I was mounting my local volume into the Docker container, that's where that's at. So I'm going to cd into there. And we should see all of my various Git images in there, or my Git directories. Whatever. Okay, so that is the bash image, just a quick example. And this is just Docker. We're running a single application, or a single image, and we're logged into it here in that shell. So I'm going to go ahead and exit that. And now I'm back to my computer's command prompt. So one of the things that you might want to do with Docker is you'll notice that we downloaded that image, as I mentioned. So you might want to see what images your computer has downloaded locally. And so you use Docker image ls, and you'll see I have a crap ton of images. This actually isn't that many images. Some of them I've built for various projects, or were built for various projects. Some of them are like PHP is going to be, and this is the tag right here, 7.3.11-fpm. So various images that I have locally on this computer. So that's Docker image ls. If you want to remove a specific image, for instance, let's find that bash image. Here it is. I'm going to grab the image ID, and I'm going to say Docker image RM, and then I'll give it that ID, and that image has been deleted from my computer. Now, most of these things that I'm showing, you're not going to need that often. I don't do this very often, but at least for me, understanding kind of these things is a helpful starting point. So if you wanted to pull just an image and not run it, you could use Docker pull, and it will download that image that we just deleted, and now it's available. It won't have to download it again. Okay, so that's just kind of the nuts and bolts on the top of how Docker works. However, I don't usually use Docker directly very often. I did the other day for reasons where I needed an image to an old MySQL image to access old MySQL databases that I had the data directory for, and the server had died, and I didn't have a backup of it because it wasn't that important, but I kind of wanted the databases. So I use Docker directly for that, but typically speaking, I don't do that. What I use, and what most people are going to use or want to use, is Docker Compose. So let me pull up this. That's not the right one. Let me open Git Docker demo. Here it is. Okay. So this is a little demo of Docker that I put together. When we get to the end, and I'll give you the URL to go find it on GitHub. It has a nice little README that explains a few things. Typically, what I do is I have a dev script that's executable in Bash or whatever your shell is. And I actually usually have a dev.ps1 for Windows as well, but for this demo, I just put together this. And this script really, all it does is it gathers all the scripts that are in here, and it makes them available. So let me open a terminal. .dev, and it will, if you don't specify a command, it'll tell you what all of the commands are that are in this directory. So if I were to put more files in here, it would make more available. That's really all this does. I guess it does a couple other things. So you'll notice, for convenience sake, I have, we're going to talk about Docker Compose.yaml in a minute. That's what tells Docker Compose how to pull the Docker images together. So I know it's hard to figure out what order to go in. But one thing that you can do with Docker Compose is specify multiple files. And so what I'm doing here is I'm setting a default. I'm saying the compose files that we want to use are dockercompose.yaml and then dockercompose.dev.yaml. And then additionally for Mac OS, I'm also specifying a .sync.yaml, which I will get to, and we'll talk about some file system performance improvements that you can make to make it run faster on Mac OS. So I think that's it for this file. Okay, so just explaining kind of how I do things with my dev script. There are multiple ways to do this. I use a dev script. And then in here are the various commands that we're going to want to run. And this is just going to make things easy. This is the .dev build command. And what that's going to do is it's going to build any of the Docker images that need to be built. So if you're specifying, I'm going to start from this image, but I want to layer in some other things, like I want to do an install of the zip package in Linux so that it's available, and then I want to install some PHP extensions or something like that. So those things need to be built, and so this is just going to build those things. This is really for if you make changes, because if you do an up, it's also going to build it, but then once it's built, you have to run build specifically if you make changes to the Docker file. So build, down, login, and up. For now, we're just going to look at up. So this is the command that you will run, Docker Compose, or that you would typically run. And again, I've just made it easy by doing .dev up. Docker Compose, you specify your compose files. I have run into problems with Docker where I needed to specify the name of the project, because otherwise it will default to the folder name or the directory name. And in some cases, I've had directory name collisions where I had the same directory name, it was just in a different directory, and that caused all kinds of trouble until I understood what was going on. So from then on, I just gave projects unique names, and I do that in my dev scripts. And then you run Docker Compose up, and then the -D is going to tell it to detach. So in other words, you don't have to keep your terminal open in order to keep Docker running. It's going to just run in the background, and that's typically what you want for development. Okay, so that preliminary out of the way. Does anybody have any questions before I dive into the Docker Compose file?
I just want to say, if you use Docker Compose override, you can use your standard Docker Compose script with instead of dev. I mean, I'm like if you replace dev with override, it'll load them. It'll automatically load override on top with dev.
I'm not
Or
sure
I
I
mean,
follow.
sorry. So it'll load Docker Compose, and then it'll also load override. So if you just rename dev to override, you wouldn't have to specify .dev, if that makes sense.
I suppose it does, but there are multiple Docker Compose files. I want more than just a single override. I suppose
Right. So the separate one. I always do. So I have 3 files. I have Docker Compose override, and prod. And then I use, basically, if I just do Docker Compose up, it automatically, with no specifying of the files, it automatically loads Docker Compose plus the override. So I don't have to do that. I don't have to specify a dev script, either script. I just loads them both up. And then I specify prod when I'm launching the production version.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Everybody's going to have a slightly different way of doing things. And that's certainly an option if you have a composed override, and it sounds like that would travel with your environment and it would be the default. And then in prod, you would specify something else, which is a perfectly valid way of doing it as well. Any other questions, or are we ready to dive into the compose files? All right, so Docker Compose, as the name indicates, it's a way to compose things together, because as I mentioned, most environments are going to require more than one container. And so you can't just run Docker up, and then you'd have to run Docker up for all your various containers, and then you'd have to remember the commands for all those. And so the configuration for your application containers are going to live in the Docker Compose file. In at least in the way I'm doing things, and I think even in the way Paul mentioned, where he would have an override, Docker Compose.yaml is going to be your base file. So this is going to define things for every environment you're going to run in. You do have to specify the Compose version, because as they version and add options and remove options, the API wants to know what version you think you're working with, and so you have to specify that in every file, or else Docker will get cranky, or Docker Compose will get cranky. 3.7 is the latest at this time. So then every Docker Compose file is going to have a services key that is going to define the container services that you want for this application. So in this case, I have a web container, which is going to be my Nginx container. Further on down here, I have a PHP container, and I have a database container, and that's going to be running Percona. Which is a MySQL complete drop-in replacement. They're interchangeable in terms of your application won't know the difference. Percona is much more performant than vanilla MySQL. That's why I use it. One thing that Docker Compose files or Docker Compose has built in, and I think it actually defaults to using .env if you don't specify it here, but I always specify it for clarity's sake. And occasionally there have been times when I wanted to use a different env file. And so I always just specify the env file. So the env file will do 2 things for you. The first thing it does is it makes any environment variable in .env available in your containers in the Linux environment as environment variables, which is very useful. I hope you're all using environment variables for production secrets and things like that. They should not be committed into your repository, even if it's a private repository. So env file, very useful, and you can see in my demo env file here, I just have a few things that are for development, and this is actually pretty typical. I usually have more environment variables in a real project, but typically the dev configuration travels in the .env.example, and you just have to duplicate that and make it .env, and you're good to go. That's usually the way that works. And then here, we're going to build a custom image from a Docker file. You could, if you don't need to make any customizations, you could get rid of this key right here and just specify the image. I'm making very light customizations, and so it'd be totally possible to do that, but I'm going to go ahead and build. I keep all of my Docker files in this Docker folder, and then I give each one of the services an additional subfolder, and so you can see there's various configuration files in there and things like that. One thing that I found useful is specifying the context as the root of the project rather than where the Docker file is at, because then you can access things at the root of the project instead of if you tried to access something outside of the root here, if this were your root in here where the Docker file is, then you couldn't access anything outside of that context. And that will become relevant in a moment. I always give my containers a friendly name that you can see when you run Docker PS. So if I run Docker PS right now, nothing is running. That's not useful. But normally it would list out your containers that are running. And if you give it a friendly name, then you can see exactly what's running instead of depending on IDs, which can change over time. The ports configuration is where we're going to specify port mapping. So one of the things that I do with my projects is I will just randomize the port. I'll use a random port generator and pick a random port for my project. That way I can run more than one at a time and not have collisions. If you were to specify 80 here, whoops, and then you also specified 80 to 80 in another container, you couldn't run those both at the same time. Mac OS or Windows or Linux, whatever you're running in, will complain to you and say that port is already mapped. So I will randomize that port for each project. That's the way I do that. The environment, the host name, that's literally just in case I ever want to drop into the command line in the environment. I have my profile and my prompt set up to show me which environment I'm in. And so that's literally all that's doing is just setting the host name so that it's identifiable when you're inside the container. Volumes is a very important concept in Docker Compose. This is where we're going to mount either a volume or a directory into the container. In this case, in Docker parlance, a volume is just some way to have, as I mentioned earlier, anything that you do inside the container is ephemeral. So if you need to save anything that you're doing in there, you're going to want to put it in the file system itself, mount a file system, mount a directory in your local file system into the container, or use a volume. A volume is something that Docker will create, and then anything that's done inside of that volume will persist across ups and downs of that container. In this case, I have created a cache volume, and I'll show you that I've created it somewhere else in the compose file. But then I'm specifying that this cache volume, so that's that, and then the colon on the other side of the colon is where we're mounting it inside the container. So in this case, I'm assuming that whatever you would mount this wherever you wanted it, but let's assume that the project that I'm going to run is going to have a cache directory in the root of the project, and so I'm mounting it right to there. And then the cache would be persistent if you needed to inspect the cache, which on for instance, craft projects, which I do, sometimes I need to get into the cache and look at the logs and things like that. And so that allows that to persist. The networks is important for container communication. And so this is where we're going to specify how that works. And you can specify a private network, but the problem with a private network is you can only communicate between these Docker containers that are in this compose file, which is normally fine. That would be totally fine for development and things like that. But when you want to run, for instance, if you're doing a little bit more budget hosting, which I'm going to show you how to do on my personal stuff. So anything at work, that all gets its own environment, and it doesn't need to communicate interoperably between each other. For my budget hosting, I'm running several sites with Docker on a single DigitalOcean instance. And so I'm running a single Nginx reverse proxy in a Docker container that then knows how to route to each of my websites. And in order to do that, you have to all be running on the same internal network. So what I've started doing is I've defaulted to a network. I'm going to go ahead and go down here and show you where I'm creating that. So I'm saying that this Docker Compose, anything in this Docker Compose here has access to a default external network named proxy. And so what that's going to do is it's going to allow not only our containers in this compose file, but all the containers on the same host machine to communicate with one another over this proxy network. So that's what this is doing, is it's saying that we're on the default network, which we specified later on in our Docker Compose file. And additionally, we're going to give it some aliases so that we can, any application on this network can get access into this container or communicate with it over these aliases, demo.localtest.me. If you're not familiar with localtest.me, that's a domain that a developer registered and pointed at its records at 127.0.0.1. So you don't have to modify your host file as long as you're on the internet. As long as the internet's active, it will point to your local machine. So that's nice. I've also, let's pretend that I have registered the domain demo.com. And then internally, I also want to be able to reference it as demo.com and www.demo.com. So these aliases tell the Docker network, I can be accessed by these aliases over this network. Here's our container for PHP. It's going to be similar with the build. Again, you could just, if you don't need to customize it, you can pull an image in directly. I'm usually doing, especially with a PHP image, I'm usually doing customization. Same thing with the container name, the environment, and host name. Volumes is going to be the same. I meant to remove this. 1 second. This is supposed to be specified in a different file. Let me make sure that it is. Yes, it is. Yeah, I just, I thought I had this all set. Apparently I don't. Web PHP, yeah, okay. This is supposed to be the PHP container. Here we go, okay. Getting back to this. So this volume is gonna be the same thing. We're mounting the cache volume in the exact same location in the PHP container. And we're telling the network that we can be accessed at demo-php, which is gonna be important for Nginx to be able to connect to this PHP container. And then we have the database container. It's going to be the same thing. We're building a customized image. If you don't need to customize it, you can pull the image directly. We do have a couple of different environment variables here. So I actually, looking at this, I don't even know if that's necessary, but in the .env file, we would specify the default root password. So the first time you boot up this container, it's going to create a root user with that password right there. And we're also saying that we can't have empty passwords. Now here we don't, because it's just running the database, we don't need access to anything other than we need persistent storage for the database. So we'll create a DB volume and we mount it into the database data directory. And here I've also mapped a random port. Actually, I think let me double check. Usually what I do is I'll just take the randomly generated port here and increment this number by 1, which is what I did. So I incremented the number by 1 and I'm routing it to 3306, which is of course the default MySQL port. And then here we're telling the network that this container can be accessed by the alias demo-db. And then here's where we tell Docker Compose to go ahead and create those volumes, which we mounted up there. And we've already talked about the network. One thing I forgot to mention in my up script, because I hadn't gotten to this point yet, is because we're doing an external network, we have to have that network created. If we do a Docker Compose up and we don't have that network created, we'll get an error. We can't connect to the external network. And so one of the things that I've done in this script is I've said, create that network. And the nice thing about this command is if the network exists, it'll do nothing. And so I'm sending the error output into null. So, so that if the network already exists, nothing happens and we don't even get notified about it. So when you do Docker up, it just makes sure that network exists. Or I'm sorry, .dev up. So that is the base compose file in this demo project. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Am I laying on the information too quick and too heavy? Everybody's dumbfounded.
Well, I think the pace is pretty good.
Okay, good. So so this is the base Docker Compose file. And so now depending on the environment, and in dev, as you saw with the dev scripts, we're automatically including this .dev.yaml, or you can do what Paul McNeely mentioned and have a Docker Compose.override, I believe he said, which will automatically get picked up, and that would be picked up in your dev environment. Whatever way you do it, this is then going to be added to the base file. So anything in here will override, if the key is the same, it will override, or in the case of like an array where you have a volumes array, it will add to that array. So this is additive. Everything in this compose file is additive. And so in development, what we're going to say is in this web container, we want to mount the root of our project into the project directory. So dot, if you're familiar with Linux command line, you'll know that dot is where you are. That's your directory that you're in. And then on the other side of the colon, we're mounting it into opt/project. And so that's where our project will live inside the container. And we're using the delegated flag. I've done various testing with this. Docker says that this will speed up your containers, your file system IO inside your container. The problem with bind mounts like this in Docker is that they can be a little slow. And this is supposed to speed them up a little bit. I can't tell a difference, but Docker says I should use this flag in their documentation, and so I do. So then in the PHP container, we're mounting the project directory in the same place. Additionally, in dev, we're going to build xdebug into our container. And so in addition to mounting directories, you can mount files as well. So it's going to just mount that file right into place. And so we're assuming, and we'll get to macOS in a minute, we're assuming Linux in this file, in this compose file. And so for whatever irritating, stupid reason, xdebug requires slightly different configuration if you're doing dev on Linux than it does if you're doing dev on macOS or Windows. So we have an xdebug.linux.ini that we're mounting into the PHP conf directory inside the container. In the DB, we are specifying these environment variables so that we don't have to define them more than once. My default for many years in the env file has been DB database, DB user, DB password. I'm also mapping those to these things. So if this database, this user, and password don't exist, they will be created the first time you spin it up. And for whatever reason, in case we need access to it, we're mounting the project directory into the database container. We probably don't need to do that, but I did. I was putting this together late one night, so. So that's the dev overrides. So additionally, you will, where did I put that? That's going to be here. You remember that this is setting the compose files that we're going to be using, and then we're detecting if it's Darwin, which is macOS, the macOS kernel, and we're saying if it's macOS, then we're going to use the sync.yaml file as well. So let's look at that real quick. So I mentioned the problem with file system IO in Docker and bind mounts. And so as it turns out, one way to solve this problem, for most PHP applications, the majority of your application IO is going to be in the vendor directory. And so volumes, as opposed to bind mounts, have almost native performance, not quite, but almost native performance to the file system on your host. And so if you can offload your vendor directory into a volume, then you're going to have much faster performance. For most of my applications, I can barely tell the difference between running natively in Linux out in production and locally once I've put the vendor direct. Now, if you have an application that's not composer based or that has a lot of IO in your actual application, this may be different for you. But for most of my projects, I've found that putting the vendor directory into a volume improves file IO tremendously. And improves application performance tremendously for local dev, which is great because before I was getting, 3 and 4 second, 5 second load times when I would refresh a page, and that's an eternity for me. So this gets you down much closer to production performance. But the problem is, if you put it in the vendor directory in a volume, then you don't have access to it in your local file system. If you want to, it comes up, you might need to do like some var dumping or, dump and die in the vendor directory to track down some bug that ultimately you caused and you thought it was in somebody else's code, but it turned out to be yours. I don't know if anybody else has that experience, but I need to do that occasionally. So the way around this is to set up syncing in the background. And so let's just walk through this configuration. So in the web directory and the PHP directory, this is going to be pretty much identical between these two. In the web container and the PHP container, we're saying that it depends on this container called bgsync vendor, and then we're mounting this vendor volume into the place where the vendor directory is, right? So in your container, the vendor directory is going to be looking at this volume. And that's where everything in the vendor directory is going to live. It's going to be transparent inside your container. That's where it's going to live. So we're doing that for PHP and for web. So now we're going to use this wonderful Docker image. And notice here, I'm not building anything. I don't need to customize it at all. So I just specify the image. It's called BG Sync. It's a pre-made image that will do all the syncing for us between your host vendor directory and the vendor volume that we're creating and mounting in there. And so all that we need in order to tell this thing to sync is to mount the vendor directory from your file system at the source directory in the container. And then we'll put the vendor volume at the destination. So this is the master, right? Your local file system is the master. If there's a conflict, this will win. And then the vendor volume is the destination. So it'll put everything in there. And the sync will go the other way as well, but you want to determine which one wins in case something goes wrong. So we've decided that the local file system and your host is the winner. And then the vendor volume is the destination. I don't know what these do, but these were in the example and I've never had any problems. So I've just put these environment variables there. Kevin, do you know what they do? You were the one that made me aware of this Docker image.
Not enough to explain on a recording.
Okay, cool.
I would encourage those, just generally speaking, for everybody who's listening, with this and like the database images. If you see environment variables, a lot of times that's a way to configure the container or the container that's built from the image. So just check out the Docker Hub image profile and see all the configuration that goes into different images. This included, I would definitely look that up.
So basically what Kevin's saying is these environment variables are basically do magic, do thing. I don't care, just do it.
Well, I notify. It's a Linux subsystem that watches files. Like that's what
right.
It does. It sits there and watches files. So that's probably telling you like set up 4,000 or 40,000 watchers to keep an eye on what's.
It sounds right. Yeah, and that's actually true on the Mac as well. So that does bring up an important thing. I'm glad you mentioned that, Paul, because this actually does work on Windows with a caveat. The sync is one way on Windows, which means that the vendor directory on the host in Windows is your master, and that's it. The sync will not go both ways. In practice, on Mac OS and Linux, even though this is source and this is destination, I've never had a problem. If I go inside the container and do something, it gets reflected in the source and vice versa. In Windows, that is not the case. So just know that if you ever have any developers that you're setting up for who work on Windows as opposed to Mac OS. That's the only downside with Windows. Everything else works just the same. I always make sure that my environments will also work on Windows because I work on Windows a lot. So that's the dev file. One more file to look at before we actually spin this bad boy up.
Sorry, can I jump in for a second? I got a question about working on Windows. I tried to install the Docker engine on Windows yesterday, as a matter of fact, and I was told that it only works on Windows Professional. Is that true?
It probably is because Docker depends on the virtualization technology in Windows, and I believe that's only available in the professional version. In addition, you'll have to turn on in your BIOS, or it's not BIOS anymore. What's the new version of that? I should know. I build computers sometimes. EFI. So in your EFI settings, you may need to enable virtualization technologies as well. And also note that you cannot use Docker and VirtualBox on the same Windows installation. At least you can't use them at the same time. You'd have to reboot and turn certain features on and off in order to, because they clash. So you can't, that is a downside. I don't use VirtualBox at all anymore since I'm all Docker all the time. So that's not a problem for me, but it was for a little while I was making the transition. So that's something to be aware of. Did that answer your question?
Yep, I'm boned.
Yeah, that was definitely a problem for me for a while, and I wound up just making the transition hard as quickly as possible to Docker. So if you can't do that, that's a problem on Windows. So and I feel sorry because it is a problem. It was a problem for me. Okay, so the production YAML file. So in addition to our normal images, I'm also going to have a utility container running, and it's literally just going to run the script, prod.sh. So that's going to be in here. We'll just look at that real quick. And all that's doing is on startup, it's making sure that the log volume exists and it has an error.log, because otherwise Nginx will fail to start and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to be putting logs in a log volume rather than just letting them go into the ephemeral storage that goes away as soon as the container goes down, because we might want access to those Nginx logs. So if those don't exist, Nginx gets all wonky. And so when that script first runs, it makes sure those exist. In addition, and this is something that I've come across with sites that have user uploads and caches and different things, sometimes the permissions on those get wacky. And so I just have this while loop running every 120 seconds that says, make sure the permissions are cool. So that's what that's doing. So that's optional. If you don't need it, get rid of it. But that's a utility image that I run in production on certain projects, on certain applications. So in the web container, we're going to use a different Docker file. It's going to be very similar because the idea with Docker is that you're mirroring production essentially. But there's just some different things that we want to do with configs and things to run in production to be more efficient. So we're going to use a different Docker file. All my production containers have this restart always set to always, and that's because if for some reason you restart the Docker daemon or you shut the server down and boot it back up and Docker restarts, you want those containers to start back up if they were running before. So I always set these to restart always in production. As I mentioned, we're going to be using a log volume to put logs into so that we can get access to those logs. Even if the container was spun down, we still have historical access to the logs as we need. In addition, if your application has uploads that are not ephemeral, you need to put those in a volume. Anything you don't want lost when the container goes down has to be in a volume. It's a similar thing with PHP. We're not going to be building Xdebug in, for instance, so we're going to use a different Docker file. I also am aware that there are ways to combine Docker files, and this is just the way I've always done it. So again, there's multiple ways to skin the proverbial cat. Restart always, log volume, uploads volume. And then here, same thing, restart always, log volume. And then we're creating the additional volumes that we're going to need here.
A question on the log volume.
Yeah.
That's just going to be writing out to, I guess, text files as each individual container is configured, right?
Well, it depends on your application. But yes, in the case of Nginx and PHP and MySQL or Percona, they expect to find the log. They write things to var log, right? And they have their log files in there. That's a pretty common, I don't know if it's a Linux-wide thing, but it's definitely Ubuntu. Anything that's Ubuntu-based is going to expect logs to be in var log. And that's where it's going to want to put them. So that's why we're just mounting the log volume to var log.
Do you know if there's an easy way to have those write to your host syslog instead of going just straight to disk?
You could probably mount your host syslog volume, or not syslog, but your host var log directory as a volume into your containers. I don't know that you would want to do that. I don't know that I would want to do that. Let me put it that way, because the whole point of containerization is to keep things separate. And so I want to put those somewhere else. And they're on Linux, volumes are very easy to access if you know where they live. They're literally just a directory in the file system that lives somewhere. And you can literally go in there in the file system, write to it, delete to it, whatever, and it's going to be reflected inside the containers where you have your volumes mounted and in the file system.
Typically with containerization as well, one recommended practice is, and the PHP and the Linux or PHP Nginx images by default do this. They will actually log out to Docker itself or to whatever the running orchestration system is, whether it's Docker, Kubernetes, or whatever. So they'll actually log out to like the Docker engine. And then you can view those. If you do it in detached state, there's still a way to view it. But if you don't detach, like TJ was mentioning earlier, when you start up your containers, you'll see the logs come across the screen. And so one way that I've seen a lot of people do logs inside containers is they'll log out to Docker. Then Docker shows the aggregation of all the containers logs as they log things. So that can be a really great way to view it. And I know at least on AWS, if you use something like Elastic Container Service and you go and you dig into each container, you can see the logs there, logging out to Docker logs to the AWS logging system as well.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up, Kevin, because so remember this -d flag, which we're using, which detaches so that it'll run in the background. But the downside of that is you can't see any output if something goes wrong. So very often, Nginx, I love Nginx, but I also hate it because it is very sensitive. And if if something is wrong, it will refuse to start or it'll die, and that's really annoying. Unlike Apache, which is very robust, if you have a bad configuration, it's going to run anyway. It might complain about it, but it'll run. Nginx will not. And so what often happens is I will have created some Nginx comp file for my Docker environment, and it won't, like, Nginx is dying as soon as it boots up. So my very first stop for that will be to remove this -d flag and then run it without detach. And so you can see the output, and you will see immediately what Nginx is complaining about because it'll output it on the screen. It'll go, oh, that's the problem. Okay, got it. So you'll be able to see Nginx's output if you do that. So yeah. Any other questions before we move on to actually running this environment?
Sam, did you get your question adequately answered about networks and proxying to your host? I don't know if he's actually on audio.
He's still here, but it doesn't look like he's muted. All right.
Mine
Well, we'll
tapped out on me earlier, so he might have dropped off and not come back.
okay. Well, it says he's here, but I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, he said stand by.
He's in the, okay.
Sorry,
Well, while we're
I just still not used to this Zoom interface.
Oh, gotcha.
Just get to find the unmute mute button. Pardon me. So, because none of my I jump between different customers, different setups. It's just we in chat we talked about the using Docker to get around all the PHP intricacies, especially around on Mac OS. But I'm running my SQL, I'm already managing customer data, and what I want to do is set up my PHP project in Docker, get a Docker compose that allows me to, reach, get outside of its container network to, my SQL server.
So are you wanting to access MySQL instance outside of Docker?
Yes.
That should be possible as long as your server is configured to allow your host IP or whatever to access it. I mean, you obviously would know what configuration that's set for. Typically, with a remotely hosted database, you lock it down by IP, but that's of course the ball would be in your court on that. There's no reason why a Docker instance wouldn't be able to do anything that it would be able to do outside of Docker. So if you wanted to access a remote DB, it's the same process that you would do if it was running right on Linux or Mac OS, right? So you would tell it, here's the host, here's the username, here's the password, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And,
it just seems like, everybody, what I've been reading says, it's isolated, completely isolated from your host OS.
Right. So, the code that's the application that's running is isolated, but it still has to be able to reach out. Like you can run a curl request in your PHP container. It's going to get out and it's going to pull down what you need to pull down. Right. So isolation doesn't mean that it can't reach out and get things. So for instance, your PHP, if you're connecting to a remote database, that's still totally possible. There's no difference between doing it in your Docker container versus doing it on an average Linux PHP instance.
And Sam, like Paul McNeely mentioned, from within a Docker container, there's a special DNS name, host.docker.internal, that points to your host. So if you're in a Docker container and your MySQL installation is running on your Mac or Windows box, you can, from within the Docker container, say that your MySQL host is host.docker.internal at port 3306 or whatever, and it'll look at your Mac for that database.
In fact, I mentioned the xdebug config earlier. I'm doing that here in the xdebug config, host.docker.internal. That's what xdebug has to look at in order to get outside the Docker container and communicate with my IDE or VS Code or PHP Storm or whatever is looking at xdebug. Now, the caveat to that I've found, people have told me host.docker.internal is supposed to work on Linux, but it doesn't. So you have to use this on Linux, and I don't know why that is. But for the purposes of you developing on a Mac, it's going to be host.docker.internal.
When you're setting up the the like domain aliases in the compose file, does that basically just write a record to like the Etsy hosts?
I don't know how it works internally, but and this is just for your internal network in Docker, right?
Yeah. But you would set like, maybe I'm misunderstanding how this would be used, but like the domain that you intended to run your project at, like your production domain, would that go in this aliases?
So this is mostly for my production config for running multiple Docker containers of different projects on a single Linux host in production. This is useful, like if you're doing curl requests and you're doing a curl request to yourself, which for better or worse happens. I've been in projects where I didn't do it, but had been done, and I had set up Docker, and I couldn't figure out why is my curl request failing when I'm trying to Dockerize this previously undockerized project. And it turns out I found the code and found out they were curling whatever the domain configuration was for that project. In dev, it would be something .dev, or we can't use .dev anymore, but whatever you're using .test or .localtest.me. And so that would fail because it's an internal private network and it didn't know how to reach itself. And so when you set up this alias on the web container, now all of a sudden curl requests in that private network can get to the Docker container. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This stuff you set up there, Justin, only has an effect inside the Docker space.
Correct.
If you want to access that same host from outside of it, you're right about the Etsy host file. There's other stuff you have to set up.
Right. So that's why I answered the way I did. In terms of the hosts, Etsy hosts file, that's completely outside of the controller domain of Docker. Docker doesn't do anything with that. But you'll notice also here, it doesn't matter what the alias is, as long as the internal network is aware of it. We're going to be using PHP FPM with this name right here. That's the PHP container. And by the same definition, we're going to be connecting to the database with this alias. And then that's all internal inside the Docker network. Almost forgot, we do need to go over these Docker files just really quickly. I wanted to show some stuff happening in production, so I need to move quicker. This is the PHP Docker file, and it's literally just installing various things that we're going to need. We're going to need zip. We're going to need unzip potentially in an application. So, we want PHP to be able to do those things. We want it to be able to manipulate images.
What is a Docker file, TJ?
A Docker file, yes. So I guess I haven't described that. So you'll notice that up here, we're telling it what image to start from. So we already know that PHP 7.4.4-FPM is going to have at least a good starting point for us because we're a PHP meetup. We're going to have PHP applications, all right? So we're telling it to start from this image that somebody out there, the official PHP community or whoever's running that that Docker hub account has already uploaded. And so we'll start from there. And it's running, at least this version is running a Ubuntu-like Linux thing. And so we can do things like apt-get update, apt-get install, and that stuff like that. In addition, Docker files have commands you can run like copy. So this is where context comes into play. The context for copy is starting at the project root, and then we're going to copy this profile into the Docker container again, so that if we drop into a bash session inside the Docker container, this is literally just so that I can easily identify what container I'm in and stuff like that. And then here, as you can see, we're installing some dependencies that PHP is going to need. It's always a good idea to run apt-get clean when you're done so that the image can be as small as possible. You don't want to maintain apt caches. And then there are some specific commands in the official Docker PHP images, like Docker PHP extension or ext install, and these are the things that we're going to need inside this container. And then down here, we're using PECL to install xdebug, and we're enabling xdebug. And then we're copying our custom. There are two ways to approach this, and the way that I've landed recently is to copy the custom config into the Docker container on build, or the Docker image on build. See there, I'm confusing container and image again. So we're creating an image with the Docker file. The downside of this that you have to be aware of is if you make changes to the config file, you have to rebuild the image. This doesn't come up very often. That's why I've just started building them into the container, into the image. I wish I'd stopped doing that. So I've just been using copy to build them right into the image. You can in dev mount these configs, and I have done that before, and that works just fine. It's whatever you want to do there. So that's the dev Docker file. The prod file, again, the idea is to keep these environments the same. And so the only things that we're doing are things that are optimizations. Like we're not installing Xdebug in production because that Xdebug is known to slow applications down. So we're not installing Xdebug in production. We're copying the production config. Here it is, config.prod. And the only difference in these configs for my applications is in prod, we're going to enable opcache, opcache. That's what we're doing here. And then we're disabling opcache in dev because we don't want to cache things as we make changes, and we don't want to wonder why changes to PHP files aren't getting picked up. So that's the only difference there. Similarly, I think that the customizations I'm making on Percona are so light it's barely worth building. And that doesn't even require a different prod file. We're doing the same exact config. We'd already did PHP. Again, Nginx, very light, just copying config files in basically, and the same thing is going to happen on prod, except we're going to copy the prod config file in. And those are just standard Nginx configs. If you're familiar with Nginx, the only thing that we're doing that's a little odd is we're saying that we're going to use port 6035 instead of 80 or 443. And again, that's so that multiple Docker instances can live side by side and not have port collisions. Pretty standard config. We're sending, this is where we're sending, Nginx is sending PHP requests to demo-php port 9000. And that's again, all internal on the internal private network. Pretty standard configs here. And production is going to be almost the same, except that we are specifying a server name of whatever our production server name is. All right, I think we're ready to run this bad boy. Does anybody have any questions before I run this thing? Okay, we're going to go ahead and run up. You remember .dev up is one of the commands, and that's going to run a couple of things. All right, and let me get a browser over here. Demo.localtest.me, port 6035, and look at that. Let's go ahead and take a look. So obviously we're outputting some PHP things. It's hitting the Nginx container. The Nginx container is sending the PHP request to PHP FPM. That's returning back some information, and ultimately Nginx is outputting that. So that's all working. In addition, we know that the database is working because I did a PDO right here where I got the database host, port, and DB name, and created a DSN and created a connection via PDO. So we know that's all working. It connected beautifully. We know that because if you can't connect, PDO would output errors here. Let's see. Oh, and then so obviously I'm getting environment variables, which we mentioned. If you specify the .env file, it will set those environment variables in the environment. So you'll notice here that the DB host is demo DB. So it's the same thing that we did with PHP. We're telling it over that network, use this alias to get to it. So that is running.
Hey, TJ, could you shut that down and run it again, but not in detached mode so everybody can see those logs we were talking about?
Yeah. Takes just a second to spin down the sync service, so we'll wait on that a moment. And while it's doing that, I will remove the detach command from there, and we'll run it again. So that's all the startup logs that you're seeing there. pgsync has a lot of them. PHP, DB. I'm surprised I don't see any Nginx output at all. That's interesting. But yeah, you can see we're running.
If you're redirecting the logs, that might be why.
I'm not in dev. Okay, so we'll stop that. And notice because we're not in detach mode, when I do Control-C, which is the interrupt command, as you should know, then it brings everything down because we're not in detach mode. It depends on this terminal being present and running in order to run its things. Oh, that's interesting. Let me do up and detach mode again real quick, just to prove a point. Notice that now that the Nginx stuff is down, site can't be reached. So we're definitely hitting Nginx. Let me do up. If we do Docker PS, which is essentially like an ls command for your file system, it's just for Docker. And then you can see, again, we gave friendly names, so we know what's running. I guess I didn't give demo BG a friendly name, but we can see what it is. And then, so you can see what's running with Docker PS. Now, I want to, real quickly, I don't think this will take long, but just show some of this happening in production. So obviously, this is great for dev environments. And it's great because if you run it in dev and in production, you are matching pretty closely your production environment, and so you're more likely to catch the same bugs in both environments that might be happening. So somewhere here, right, so I recently, this is a site that I've had for years, and I haven't done anything with it in years, but then recently, a couple months ago, the server died, more like 6 months ago, and I thought, you know, I should probably do something about that. And so I Dockerized this old Expression Engine 2 application, and which was very handy because, as it turns out, this version of Expression Engine doesn't run on, let me double check myself here. It definitely doesn't run on PHP 7. I had to pull 5.6 in. And again, Docker makes this really nice because PHP 5.6 is just an image out there that we can pull. And so I did. You can go back as far as 5.3, I believe. I believe you can get Docker to go back to 5.3. I think there's 5.3 images. Don't quote me on that. And Expression Engine 2 wound up needing a little bit different configurations, and some things needed to be installed here that don't need to be for Expression Engine 5, et cetera, et cetera. But it's the same, it's more or less the same philosophy that we just went over. It's just a little more built out, a little more things going on. And so if we do new terminal, .dev up, we're going to be able to load. Now we've got the other one running as well on port 6035. This one's running on 18886. And so there's a local dev of my site. So you, of course you can do whatever you need to do. I think I have Xdebug working on this. So if I were to set a breakpoint there, and if I were to go here and, no, I don't have Xdebug working on this. Maybe I have it working on this one. No, I don't. Let's see. Oh, you know what? I have Xdebug working on, do I not have that open? Oh, nope, there it is. I know I have Xdebug working over here. So let's go to public index.php, and let's set a breakpoint right there. And let's go to listen for incoming. That would be because we're not running. Stop that. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, now we can listen for Xdebug connections. Right, I have faux HTTPS on this site. There it is. Well, we have a call stack. I don't see any variables. That's odd. Okay. I was just using Xdebug here the other day. There it is. Okay. So I know this is working. So you can see that Xdebug is working with Docker. It's all working in Docker and communicating back to my IDE here. So if you have, I only recently got Xdebug working and started using it a lot, but I use it all the time now. So I highly recommend making sure you get that working. It is game changing. Because you can see the whole call stack and you can inspect all the variables and everything that's going on. You can skip to the next breakpoint, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's look at this in production. And this is going to be a really simple, obviously this can scale way up. Everything that I do at HappyCog is all running on ECS, and I barely know how to use all that stuff. But for small-time DevOps, all that I have running this site, let's just go over here. Can't type when I'm doing a demo. It's universal truth. So all I have running this site is a simple $10 DigitalOcean container. It is also running this site, and it will soon be running more as I move more and more of my stuff into Docker. I've been slow at getting my personal stuff in the Docker because until recently it was all working and it was fine. And so most of the stuff that I have running in Docker in production is for a client. But yeah, so both of these sites are running on the same DigitalOcean instance. You can see they're very fast. I assume my connection's not lagging, so you can see how fast it is. And they're both running in the same environment. So let's take a peek at that real quick. Actually, yes, I actually have in this example a demo script that will, quote, deploy this application. And you would place this demo script on your server, and it will run a deploy. So you can kind of, when I give you the URL to this repository, you can kind of look through it. But it's essentially we're storing, and again, in a big time environment, you would have a different build server from your production server, and you would move, once you've built it over here, then you would move it to your production server. But we're talking small time DevOps here. So we have the Git repository on the production server. This is just going to pull master. It's going to copy the contents of the repository that it just pulled into the release directory. It's going to copy the env file that we're storing somewhere else into the release directory. Assuming that you have your, wherever your cache is at, it's going to make sure permissions are right on that. It's going to build the use Docker Compose to build the application containers. And then it's going to bring Docker Compose down, and it's going to make sure some of this may be cargo cult. I've had problems with Docker not actually coming down. And so after I've done down and I've asked it nicely, then I say, you better be down. Because what happens if it doesn't actually come down is it won't spin up the new containers. So this is all basically just like, I asked nicely, and if you didn't, then you're coming down one way or another. So that's what that's doing. And then this is activating the new containers. So with this deploy script, you will have 5 or 6 seconds of downtime, right? Not a big deal for small time stuff, but this is why you build and get things ready on a separate instance and move it over and do blue-green deployments and all that, right? Okay, so then it's going to, the way, again, I mentioned I had the Nginx proxy on my production server. So this is actually, I've found that for whatever weird reason, sometimes the proxy has some sort of cache and it's serving something that it shouldn't, even though you spun something else up. So I basically just said, okay, take the proxy down and bring it back up after I've done all the other deploy steps. And then here is Docker prune. That's very important in production because as you build images, if you don't prune them, the old ones will just stick around until you fill your disk up. So Docker system prune and delete all your previously built images because they're no longer useful. And then this is just a loop that will delete any releases because it creates a release directory for every deploy. And this will just delete any that are, it only keeps 4. Well, it keeps however many you set up here. So rotate is set to 4. It'll keep 4 of the most recent release directories around. So that's pretty much the script that I'm going to show you. So let me get into my production environment. So this is the production environment for moviebyte.com and tjdraper.com. And and again, this is just a pre-made, this literally came from a pre-made DigitalOcean droplet that I said, hey, spin me up a Docker thing. And I did some light customization of it. And you can see here's my MovieByte and here's my tjdraper.com directories. I have the Nginx master. Let's look at that real quick. So this is the one that's actually mapping port 80 to port 80 so that outside traffic, and 443 to 443, so the outside traffic can get into this reverse proxy. This is a very simple Docker Compose file. It's literally just pulling in Nginx. Again, restart always. And then it's pulling in anything in the conf directory, and it's mounting it to nginx conf.d. It's mounting anything in the SSL directory. I am also using certbot with Nginx. So in order to have permanent storage for certbot certificates, I'm using a volume. Because again, remember that anything inside the containers are ephemeral. And in addition, if you use a volume, then any other container can access those as well. And so we have a separate certbot container that will run that will renew the certificates, or when I need to create one, will let me create them. So that's what's going on here. And it's connecting to that external proxy network, again, so that it can communicate with the other containers on this instance and do the reverse proxy that it needs to do. So then let's go into the conf directory. conf.d. So there's my configs for the reverse proxies. And all this is doing, first of all, it's making sure that we redirect HTTP traffic to HTTPS. And it is just doing a redirect there. And then here we are serving over 443. You saw where I had mounted the certbot volumes onto both containers, so that I've mounted them into the Let's Encrypt directory, and so I can access the certificates. And then this is the primary site config right here. So the other one was redirecting non-www traffic to www. And then this one is the actual proxy. So right here, you see the proxy pass. It's going to notice the port. It is because we did not change the port because we want these applications to be able to live side by side. It's redirecting all traffic internally inside the Docker network to the site on this port. And it's setting the best practices. It's telling it that it's setting these headers X forwarded for, and etc. Let's do a deploy real quick. No, I need to go. Where am I? cd.tjdraper.com. Let's add in the public directory a new file, hello world.html. And let's make sure that works. I don't have some weird Nginx config. There it is. So that's running in local dev. You probably can't see my control bar for Zoom, but it got my way. There we go. And then on the live website currently, that is a not found. That is not there. So let's go here and let's say add demo page. We'll commit that and we'll push it up to master. Give that a second. There it goes. And now we're going to run the deploy script. VI, let's just look at that real quick. Deploy. So you can see it's pretty similar to what I showed you in that demo repository. It's got the build Docker images, deactivate Docker, activate Docker, prune Docker, all that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and run it. And that'll take a minute. So now it's going to build the images based on the Docker files that were for production. Oh, I don't remember if I showed you Docker PHP Docker file. So in production, instead of mounting the project directory into Docker, I actually build it in. So I copy the project directory into the container so that it's not having to do like a bind mount. It's just in the container. It's part of the container. It's part of the image. So to create that image, we're copying the everything that's current in master and get into that image. So it just stopped Docker, the Docker images. Now it should be bringing them back up. In theory. There we go, creating. Oh, and now it's rebooting the Nginx master, the one that does the proxy. It's like watching water boil. All right, and then you see there it pruned. So it pruned a bunch of images that we no longer need that it had created with the previous deploy. And now we should have a hello world page in production. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover. Does anybody have any questions? It's hard to tell how you people are reacting with Zoom and everybody muted.
There's been some good chat going on the side, just people asking questions and other people helping each other out. So
I have not been able to look at the chat because I've been doing it live in this demo.
Do it live.
Just for to kind of circle back to what we were talking about earlier, do you mind showing the alias part of your production setup that you just demoed here?
What do you want to see? It's exactly the same.
I mean, like earlier how you had demo.com. Like, I'm just curious.
Oh, I see. Sure. So here's tjdraper.com. Here is Docker Compose. This is slightly different. Okay, no, it's the same. Okay. So in case I ever do curl requests, I have the local dev address, and then I have the production addresses so that the reverse proxy can just access it by its actual domain name.
Okay. So from inside the container, tjdraper.com would be this
tjdraper.com, yeah.
This container, but from outside the container,
it's also tjdraper.com.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's why I set the aliases to be the domain name so that I don't have to keep track of, oh, I'm doing a curl request to myself. No, it's the same. It's literally the same.
Got it. Okay. Sorry, that it makes more sense to me now that I've seen like it actually working. So
yeah. And again, I have to stress, since you've seen my production, like my site, and I've got it back up, I did this design years ago. I'm much better than this now. Yeah. Oh, somebody was asking.
Site just rolled out.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find that. Nope, not buzzingpixel.com. Docker simple demo. So it's github.com/buzzingpixel/Docker simple demo. I think I had some updates that I did on the fly that were messed up. Let's see what those are. Right, I'm not supposed to be doing that there, so I remove that. And that was the wrong container name, so I removed that. Let me fix Docker Compose files. Let me push those up real quick. All right. So github.com/buzzingpixel/docker/simple-demo. You know what? It'll be easier if I put these in Slack. Okay, because I haven't been able to pay too close attention to the chat, does anybody want to ask me any of those questions that may not be answered yet?
No questions here.
Was this kind of fly by the seat of my pants? Was this presentation useful to y'all?
Yeah, I think this is going to be hugely beneficial to me, especially having access to all these files. Like this is the perfect framework for me to take, and then I can tweak this or that thing, but I know that it should work as is in a very simple sort of setup.
One thing I'll note, if you're gonna, and as you should, that's kind of what I meant it for, is kind of a simple starting point if you've never used Docker before. One thing I should note though, I pared down the PHP Docker file because usually you don't want to build stuff into the Docker contain images that you don't need. But most of my production images actually do need various things. I am doing MySQL, which I don't see in here, so it must be built into PHP FPM. I'm running Percona on buzzingpixel.com on the upcoming version of it, and that is not built in. And so I must have closed it. Let me open it again. I want to open getbuzzingpixel.com. Okay, I want to go into Docker, PHP, Docker file. Right, so I had to build in Postgres support. What did I say before? I don't think I said Postgres, but I meant Postgres.
Said Percona before.
I meant Postgres. Percona is completely interchangeable with MySQL. So I'm running Postgres on BuzzingPixel. Postgres? I don't know how you say that. I'm a developer. I don't speak the words.
Postgres.
So anyway, I'm building support for Postgres into PHP here. So you have to install some things in Linux, and then you have to actually enable the PGSQL extension. And then you actually also have to do PDO PGSQL. These are trial by fire things that I had to figure out in order to run Postgres. So just even though that's a starting point, just be aware that I pared down the file because, you only want to build in things that you need for your application to keep it lean. But you pretty much have access to the same things you would in any Ubuntu instance. I'm less familiar with, I pretty much run Ubuntu in production, so I'm less familiar with other distros, but to me, it feels just like Ubuntu. So
do Docker files still have like a limit to the amount of layers you can have? I know that they used to long ago.
Not that I'm aware of, so that maybe is gone, or maybe I've just never run into it.
I ask because I normally split up I normally take like what you have there and do all as one run command, because every separate command you have in there is a new layer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've seen people do different ways. I've done this because it makes subsequent builds, like if I need to change this line, subsequent builds are much faster, but it does create more layers. That is true. And if I were to package these to put up on Docker Hub, I would definitely do it on a one-liner. I don't, again, for custom images that are never going anywhere, I usually do them line by line. And I haven't so far run into any limits. But again, as always, there are multiple ways to approach things and multiple ways to get the job done.
It looks like the old limit of 42 layers is not a thing anymore, but there is still on a lot of systems a 127 layer limit.
There is not 127 layers to this file, so that's why I haven't run into it.
Yeah, but if the 42 layer limit was still in effect, I'd probably hitting close.
I would probably hit it because this already has a few layers of its own, right? So I'm starting from PHP 7.4.2 and I'm down here to line 40. So I would almost certainly have run into it if it were still a thing. You're absolutely right. And again, like I said, if I were going to package this up and put it on Docker Hub, I would definitely do a one-liner once I got it the way I wanted. I might do single lines to tweak it and run it and make sure it was doing what I wanted, but then I would put it in a one-liner with the escapes to do line breaks and that sort of thing. So yes, definitely things that I take for granted that I already know, but like, if you're just fresh Docker, you may not know, hey, it's best practice if you're going to package something up to put it somewhere for others to make it a single layer rather than a multi-layer thing.
And if I was going to deploy this on like a AWS kind of production environment, would it be standard to deploy each of these services inside like a separate EC2 instance or ECS or whatever?
I wonder if somebody's here who knows more about ECS than I do.
Yeah, I've deployed an application to ECS. There's different ways you could set it up. If you're doing EC like a classic EC2 instance, just like an Amazon image, you could set it up the exact same way TJ is showing you here, that you would just be using an image instead of an EC2 image instead of a Docker DigitalOcean droplet. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to set up, Amazon has so many different services and there's different ways of setting this up. Yeah. Just like DigitalOcean has a managed Kubernetes service, but that's not what TJ is using here.
No, not at all.
Amazon has a managed Kubernetes and a managed Docker or a managed container service that you can, but you don't have to use. The way that I've deployed applications on AWS is using the ECS. There's one where there's one version of that service where they abstract out the need to build your own EC2 instances, and I can't remember the name of it right
Starts
now.
with an F.
Yeah. It's what is that?
It's like a containers as a service type thing where you just basically tell it. Fargate. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. So that's the way we did it. We're basically if you look at what TJ showed in the Docker Compose files, that is a configuration for an orchestration of Docker containers.
That's essentially what Docker Compose is an orchestration for Docker containers.
Right. Yeah, that's not the only way to orchestrate. You can also, Amazon has its way of doing it. There's Kubernetes as well. So there's different ways of doing that. I would recommend looking into those. Like ECS at the simplest is pretty easy to sort of set up each one of those services and then sort of release it into the wild. And it can really deal with scaling and all sorts of things very nicely. So
yeah,
Amazon also has, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that Amazon has Kubernetes built in as well now. So it's Kubernetes as a service, essentially. I just find that, like, while Kubernetes is extremely popular, it's also got a very high barrier to entry.
Absolutely.
While like a Docker Compose file, I find that really straightforward and easy to use. So
super easy
you can
to understand.
start there, but you know, Kubernetes is something worth learning, but it's much more difficult.
One of the big benefits to what TJ showed here is most people get started early using Docker Compose to set up their dev environments. So it's easier to understand taking that same paradigm into production and seeing what's possible there. Then once you're comfortable with that, you can look at Docker Swarm or some of these other orchestration options if they might work better for your production environment. So.
Yeah, gotcha. I have no doubt now, because I started with the fundamentals. And so essentially the way I came to this was we were running a pretty standard, few years ago, pretty standard, we were DigitalOcean droplets, and, you know, they were standard Nginx, PHP, and I wound up custom building PHP because a lot of our sites were old and needed 5.3 support, and there was no budget to update them. And the client was just paying for hosting. Essentially, it was like a monthly retainer, and we make sure their site stays up. So there was no budget to upgrade, and so we had to custom build PHP 5.3. And Docker would have made that so much easier, but I wound up spending a week already a couple of years ago, just trying to build PHP 5.3 was a pain in the hindquarters. But I got it running, and so then as I was continuing on, this is my previous employment, I'm still contracted with them to do their DevOps because I set it all up. So we have everything running on droplets. And then as I started getting into Docker, we started using it for dev so that developers could easily spin up the environment. And then I'm like, well, but the whole point of Docker is that you're matching production as much as possible, or at least in my mind, that's what the point was. And so we started deploying Docker. So the newer stuff is Docker. And because droplets are $10, and most of these clients, again, this was a shop that was doing dev for the whole purpose of this shop is we're here to help our local community. And most of these people don't have the big budgets that you know, we might have at HappyCog now. And so it's $10 droplets, and we're deploying with Docker now to these $10 droplets in a very similar manner to what I just showed you. I actually do have some software that's orchestrating the deployments rather than doing it right on the server. But other than that, like, and each site, each client gets their own droplet, so there's none of the shared stuff going on. So I just map port 80 directly to 80 on those Docker containers. There's no in between with Nginx. So there's multiple ways to do it. This is the production environment that I just showed you that we just deployed that file to tjdraper.com. That's this guy. So it's a 2 gigabyte memory, 50 gigabyte disk. You can see, again, this is why if you need to scale up much, you probably do want something other than your production environment doing your builds, because you can see I spiked memory here. I definitely spiked the CPU load here when we deployed. But this is a $10 droplet. So for small time stuff, for your own projects, like, it's super easy to get started, and it's a great starting place.
I just dropped a link into the chat. I'll put it in Slack as well, but one of the great things about Docker on DigitalOcean is they have a pre-built, I know TJ mentioned the pre-built Ubuntu droplet. They also have a pre-built Docker droplet that is Docker on Ubuntu. So
that's the one I used, was the pre-built Docker droplet.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you meant you'd use the
No,
Ubuntu.
I may have mentioned it, but years ago, I think it was 3 years ago when I started at DeBose, and we started doing, you know, moving everything to DigitalOcean. I started with their Ubuntu 16 droplet at the time. So I might have mentioned that as well. But for this droplet came from the Docker base that DigitalOcean has.
Cool.
And just in case nobody's familiar with DigitalOcean, I like to sing their praises once in a while. A droplet is essentially a virtual server, but it's, as far as you're concerned, when you interact with it, it's a server, right? You saw me log into it with SSH. Ubuntu is my favorite flavor, and they're wonderful.
It's pretty much the same as an EC2 instance in Amazon.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, and I I try not to speak too much to EC2 because I just don't know it very well, but everything that I work on, I don't do DevOps at my day job. I do DevOps on the side. So other people deal with the DevOps, but I have to interact with a little bit as a developer. And I do know that, for instance, the one that I was working on today, we were actually working on some deployment stuff because we needed to deploy and the deploy was messed up. We inherited the site from somebody else. And I know the way that one works. And again, somebody else set this up. This may not be the way it's supposed to work, but there are 3 instances for this production site. The deployment will take an instance offline, pull it out of the orchestration so that, the load balancer only sends it to the 2 that are active. It deploys the code to that one and puts it back in, pulls another one out and sets. So it essentially, does the same thing that we're doing, but just on each instance. And then there's a load balancer in the mix that sends it to the right, there's much more orchestration in place, but it's still essentially the same thing that we're doing here.
Really great stuff, TJ. Thanks for sharing.
Why, thank
all
you.
that.
Why, thank you.
Anybody else got any final questions? I've already seen some people dropping, so I don't want to keep people longer than they want to be here. But anybody else got any final questions for TJ?
This was tremendous. Thank you.
Yeah, great presentation, TJ.
This is
awesome.
I think this is the first presentation I've ever done that didn't have slides and that had like pretty much all live code. So yeah, it was a little different for me.
Definitely helpful for me.
Well, I may not be quick to respond, but I'm always around in the Slack. Like I have Slack open for work anyway, so it's just sitting there in the sidebar and I'll check it once in a while. So if you have any questions for me or anybody else for that matter, there's people a lot smarter about Docker than I am. But the thing that I love about Docker is, you can start anywhere. You can start really small and build your knowledge up that way. And in fact, I think it's better to start small than to start with I've jumped into this project and it has, the EC2 stuff going on. I don't know how that works. Like, it's kind of easier to start from the beginning, really.
Indeed. Well, thanks again.
Yeah.
Glad everybody who made it could make it. This was an interesting experiment. I enjoyed it. We'll see what happens. Like I said, this can be a really great platform if you got an idea, even if it's more of a lightning talk kind of thing. It doesn't have to fill up even a full hour or hour and a half. But if you've got an idea that you want to throw out there and we can all kind of talk about it, have a bit of a roundtable about something, even if it's not a fully formed presentation, let us know. I think we'd all enjoy seeing that kind of thing and kind of tossing in on it. So, like I said, I think organizers at NashvillePHP.org is the way to get to us. So, thanks for coming, everybody. We'll see y'all later.
Thank y'all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.